She stood on the dock at Southampton, holding a suitcase that contained everything she owned. Her mother was crying. Her father stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, refusing to look at her. She was 22 years old, married to a man she'd known for 8 months, and about to sail across the Atlantic to a country she'd only seen in movies. The baby in her arms, born 3 months ago, was American. Her husband had already gone back to New York, promising to meet her when she arrived. If she arrived. It was January 26, 1946, and she was about to board the SS Argentina, the first official war bride ship to America. 452 British women, 173 children, and 1 bridegroom climbed aboard that day. They waved goodbye to England, and most of them had no idea if they'd ever see it again. How do you leave everything you've ever known for a man you barely know? What happens when the fairy tale of marrying an American GI meets the reality of small-town America? And what did those first war brides find when they stepped off the ship 9 days later into a country that had no idea what to do with them? The war brides weren't a surprise. They were inevitable. Starting in 1942, American soldiers flooded into Britain by the hundreds of thousands, preparing for D-Day and the liberation of Europe. They were young, confident, well-paid compared to British soldiers, and they had access to luxuries most Brits hadn't seen in years: chocolate, cigarettes, nylon stockings, chewing gum. The phrase overpaid, oversexed, and over here became a bitter joke among British men who watched American GIs charm their way through pubs and dance halls. But the women saw something else. They saw young men who were polite, who had money to spend on dates, who talked about a country where food wasn't rationed and houses had central heating, and everyone could afford a car. They saw escape. Britain was exhausted, bombed out, gray with rationing and loss. America sounded like a dream. And when a handsome GI asked a girl to marry him after knowing her for a few weeks or months, thousands of them said yes. By the time the war ended in 1945, more than 70,000 British women had married American servicemen. There were thousands more from France, Belgium, Holland, Italy, Germany, Australia. The U.S. government faced a problem: how to get all these foreign brides and their children to America when immigration quotas didn't allow it. So in December 1945, Congress passed the War Brides Act, exempting foreign spouses and children of American servicemen from immigration restrictions. The military would pay for transport. Operation War Bride, nicknamed Operation Diaper Run by the press, was born. The SS Argentina was chosen to make the first voyage. It was a luxury ocean liner that had been converted into a troop transport during the war, carrying over 200,000 soldiers across the Atlantic. Now she'd carry brides. The ship was hastily refitted with cribs, high chairs, nurses, and Red Cross personnel. The accommodations weren't luxurious. These women would be sleeping in converted troop quarters, but they were free, and that was what mattered.
On January 26, 1946, the women boarded. Some were excited, chattering about their new lives. Others were terrified, clutching babies and crying as they said goodbye to parents who thought they'd never see their daughters again. The few had met their husbands only weeks before the men shipped out. Some had never even been to the towns they'd be living in, just addresses scrawled on letters. They trusted their husbands' promises that everything would be wonderful. The voyage was a nightmare. The Argentina sailed straight into 2 massive winter storms. The ship pitched and rolled for 9 days instead of the usual 4 or 5. Nearly everyone was seasick, babies screamed, the smell of vomit filled the corridors. Women who'd never been on a ship before lay in their bunks convinced they were going to die. The staff did their best, but there was only so much you could do when the Atlantic was throwing a tantrum. And in the middle of it all, there was one man aboard, a war groom technically, a sergeant named Lomaru, who'd married a British woman and was desperate to get back to her. When he heard she was pregnant, he tried to get a visa to return to England, but was denied. So he signed on as a messman on the Argentina, hoping it would dock in Liverpool where his wife lived. It docked in Plymouth instead. He tried to sneak off posing as a passenger, failed, and when the ship left for Le Havre, he dove overboard fully dressed and swam for shore. Desperation makes people do impossible things. Finally, on February 4th, 1946, the Argentina steamed into New York Harbor. The women crowded onto the deck, staring at the skyline, at the Statue of Liberty, at a city bigger than anything most of them had ever imagined. They'd been briefed on what to expect: American customs, American food, American manners, but nothing really prepared them for the shock of it. The press was waiting. 200 reporters, photographers, newsreel cameras, Mayor William O'Dwyer, a band playing cheerful music. It was a spectacle, the first war brides stepping onto American soil, a symbol of victory and romance and new beginnings. The women tried to smile, clutching their babies, scanning the crowd for the husbands who'd promised to be there. Most were. Some weren't. One woman waited for hours and her husband never came. She had his address, a small town in Pennsylvania, but no money to get there and no idea what to do. A Red Cross worker helped her onto a bus and she traveled inland alone, baby in her arms, hoping he'd just mixed up the dates. He had. But the fear she felt in those hours, wondering if she'd been abandoned in a foreign country, never fully left her. The culture shock was immediate. America was loud, bright, overwhelming. Food wasn't rationed, grocery stores overflowed with things the women hadn't seen in years. But it was also alien. The accents were strange, the customs were different. Small-town Americans stared at British brides like curiosities, asking them to say something in English, as if they weren't already speaking it. And the men they'd married were often not what they'd seemed overseas. In Britain, soldiers on leave were charming, generous, romantic. Back home in America, they were just regular guys with regular jobs and regular problems. Some returned to families who hated the idea of a foreign daughter-in-law. Others went back to small towns where everyone knew everyone, and the British bride was an outsider who'd never fit in. Some men had lied about their jobs, their homes, their families, painting a picture of prosperity that didn't exist. The Argentina made multiple trips in 1946, followed by dozens of other ships: the RMS Queen Mary, MS Saturnia, USAT Zebulon B. Vance. By the end of 1946, nearly 70,000 war brides from Britain alone had arrived in America, along with thousands more from other countries. It was one of the largest waves of female immigration in U.S. history. Some marriages thrived. The couples built lives, raised families, and the war brides became Americans, though they never quite lost their accents or stopped missing England. Others fell apart within months. Divorce rates among war bride marriages were high, not surprising when you consider that many couples barely knew each other. Some women went back to Britain, others stayed because they had children, or because going back felt like admitting failure, or because America, even disappointing, still offered more opportunities than war-torn Europe. Decades later, the surviving war brides would gather at reunions, sharing stories of that first voyage, of the storms and the sickness and the fear, and the hope. They'd talk about what they'd left behind and what they'd found. Most didn't regret it. Even the ones whose marriages failed often said they'd do it again, because staying in Britain felt like slow suffocation, and going to America, even into the unknown, felt like freedom. The SS Argentina was scrapped in 1964, 18 years after carrying those first brides across a stormy sea. But her legacy lived on in the hundreds of thousands of women who followed, who made impossible choices, who left everything they knew for love or hope or desperation. She stood on the dock at Southampton, holding a suitcase that contained everything she owned. 9 days later, she stood in New York Harbor holding a baby and a dream that might or might not come true. That was the bargain. That was the risk. And she, like 452 other women that day, decided it was worth it.